Who is your favorite biblical character?
Cornelius.
Cornelius. I got a Daniel. David. Okay. Calm down. It's okay. I heard it. David. Joseph. All right. Joseph's a good one. Who else? Ruth. Esther. Okay. Aubrey said God. That's important. Okay. What about Paul? Anybody like Paul the best? Donald?
Later in his life. Not so much early.
Okay. The Apostle Paul is fascinating. He's a fascinating character. Can anybody guess how many individuals are connected to Paul in Scripture? Named individuals, okay, who are connected somehow to Paul in Scripture. That is, they were named in the epistles as being friends, fellow workers, in Acts as traveling with him. Anybody have a guess how many? No, I got a 55. 52. Going the wrong way. It's higher. It's going to shock you. It shocked me. It may not shock you, but it did shock me. Anybody else? This side of the room is very quiet. 150, too high. 99, too low. Can you believe 120 individuals? 120 individuals are connected to the Apostle Paul. That's a lot. That just floored me, because when I think of Paul and his companions, we think of Barnabas, Apollos, Timothy, Titus, and then we probably just go, Barnabas, yeah, that's another one. That's a good one. And then it's just like, And that's because out of all of the 120 individuals that are connected to Paul, they really, really fall into 4 groups. 4 categories, not really groups, because some were actually enemies of Paul and betrayed him. We think of Alexander, he talked about, for instance, Bar-Jesus in the book of Acts. They stood against him. You could have the second category be individuals who are well known, and those are the ones we think of. We always go to the second category of individuals. That's the Barnabas and the Apollos and the Timothy and the Titus. There's a third category of individuals who are known by name, but not much else. Not much else. And so you have like individuals that he named in letters, and maybe you have a short description of like Erastus, for instance. And then there are a group, this 4th group, where we know nothing about, just their name. It's just a flat, say hello to so-and-so at the end of a letter. Say hello to Eubulus. Everybody loves Eubulus. Say hello to Eubulus for me. And that's all we know about him. I thought it would be kind of fun, maybe. Either that or I'll wake y'all up in about 20 minutes. But I thought it would be kind of fun if we just take one of these names that fall into the third category. We don't really want to talk about the enemies of Paul and the ones who are well known, we're kind of well versed in, and the ones that are just named and we don't know anything about, we can't really talk about them. But let's go to this third category and see an individual that's actually a very compelling individual. It would have been great to have known him, I guarantee. But it's a man by the name. Now, if you have grandchildren coming, write it down. It'll be on the top 10 list of baby names. You ready? Tychicus. If you have a baby coming in your family somewhere, go up to mama and say, hey, you need to use the name Tychicus. Because I guarantee you there is not going to be anyone named Tychicus born in 2022 or 2023, at least in this country, probably. If there is, that would be impressive, right? But Tychicus, and he belongs in this third category because we don't know a whole lot about him, but we do know a little bit. He's really mentioned, and we get an overall view of this character when we look at Paul's letter to the Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 6, he's mentioned in verse 21, he says, Ephesians 6:21, so that you also may know how I am and what I am doing, Tychicus, and here's probably one of the most shining descriptions of a person that could come from Paul. It would be such an honor for Paul to think of someone like this. He says, Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister or servant in the Lord will tell you everything. Isn't that a great description? I would love to be known as that, described as that by individuals. I would hope you would want to be known as that. But then someone like Paul, the Apostle Paul, the one who wrote the majority of the New Testament, the one who is an apostle and did all of these great things that we read about in the book of Acts, to think of you as not just a brother, but a beloved brother. But then even more so, more importantly, on the spiritual side of things, call you a faithful minister, a faithful servant. What's really interesting about Tychicus is Tychicus, that's not a Jewish name. He was a Gentile. Now, we mentioned Paul in his early life. He wasn't really a nice fellow when it comes to Christianity, right? What was he known for?
Killing Christians.
He was killing Christians. In fact, he would lament about it in his letters time and time again. I mean, it weighed heavily on him in his past, even though he knew he was forgiven for it, but he was binding Christians up. He was hunting them down, basically. And man, when it came time to vote, whether they would live or die, at one point he said, I always voted thumbs down. And so, Paul, he was a Pharisee. He was a Jew. And coming from that sect of Pharisees, they were very, very strict in the way they treated non-Jews. And so it's very ironic about his relationship and him calling Tychicus a beloved brother and a faithful servant. The ironic thing is, had Paul never converted, he would have never met Tychicus. Because Tychicus was a Gentile. And Paul would have had nothing to do with him. Nothing to do with them. Because how did Jews feel about Gentiles? They hated them, didn't they? In fact, one of the biggest problems in the church in the first century was this racism, this racial tension between these two ethnicities of Jews and Gentiles. And yet here's Tychicus, who is a beloved brother and a faithful minister. And it's funny when you go to Ephesians 2, as Paul's writing this letter, he talks about this divide of Jew and Gentile and how that Jesus and the work of Jesus broke down that middle wall so that all ethnicities can now be one. And that describes the relationship between Paul and Tychicus perfectly. Because had it not been for Christianity, that relationship wouldn't have existed. But what I want to do tonight is look at Tychicus. He's mentioned 5 times throughout the New Testament. And as we look at these 5 passages, we'll pick up some of the work that Tychicus was doing. And then after we look at all 5, I want us to put them together and make one point of application for us. I want us to see something about this man whose name, but we hardly know anything about him, but who was so beloved by the Apostle Paul and was thought of by Paul as a faithful minister. The first time we read his name, as we read consecutively through the New Testament, it's going to be in the book of Acts, and it's going to be in Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. And we read about Tychicus in verse 4. Now, in Acts chapter 20, we need to kind of set the scene. It's summertime, and we are in the year 55. Isn't that weird? We're just in the year 55, not 2022 or 20. We're used to 4-digit years, right, in our lifetime. We're in the year 55 AD. And what is occurring in Acts 20 is a description of Paul's journey, his final journey to Jerusalem. Now, just offhand, who can remember what Paul was doing going to Jerusalem? What was his purpose for going?
Council? Meet with the council? Meet with the group?
No, it's after that. This is after. Anybody? In 2 Corinthians, what does he remind? Do you remember what does he remind the Corinthian brethren to do? He was asking all of these Gentile churches to cooperate and do something very specific.
Help them.
To help the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem was having a lot of problems with oppression. They were having a lot of problems because of these individuals who grew up in the Jewish religion being ostracized by their family for turning to Jesus, for becoming Christians. And that was hurting them financially as well. And so Paul was going around, part of his missionary journeys, and he was getting these Gentile churches to collect money for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And so now he is traveling back in the summer of 55. Almost sounds like the Bryan Adams song, doesn't it? The summer of 55, he's going down to Jerusalem, and he's not going alone. He has an entourage with him. Chapter 20 of Acts, verse 4, gives us the list of names, and here we find Tychicus listed for the first time. It says, Sopater the Berean, the son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. And so here is Paul's final trip to Jerusalem, and his purpose is to take this money that the Gentile churches and the Gentile Christians had collected to help these poor individuals, these poor Jewish Christians in the Jerusalem church. What's interesting, when we go down to verses 16 and 17, we read the detail of why. He says, For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. And so in this scene, what's going on is he's going to stop in Miletus because he does want to talk to the Ephesian elders one last time. He doesn't think he's going to see them again. Paul knows that something's about to happen. And so that sets the scene. And so he has 8 men. Now we mentioned 7. Who can tell me who the 8th man was? And he's not named, but a pronoun tells us who. Luke. How do we know it's Luke?
Luke wrote Acts.
Well, Luke wrote Acts, and he changes to the first person plural pronoun of we. And so it's we now. This is one of the we sections of Acts, as it's called. And so Luke is with them. And so why carry such a large entourage? Well, there's a couple of theories for this, and we can kind of have to use a little bit of intuition to understand why. First would be protection. There's safety in what? Numbers. And walking, traveling like this throughout these roads headed toward Jerusalem, no doubt was a dangerous venture, especially when what's in their bag? A whole lot of money. You go out to Times Square circa 1979 with $5,000 in your pocket. See how long it gets you, right? You don't want to do that alone. So it could be for protection, and that seems reasonable. But it also could be that Paul wants to make sure everybody knows this is on the up and up. He'd invited all of these different Gentile churches to give him money for him to take down to Jerusalem. And you know what? I'm going to take with me individuals from all of these different regions. So the Gentile churches will know, so all of these Christians will know I'm on the up and up. What was happening to Paul's reputation that we read about in his letters time and time again? He's being trashed by these Judaizing teachers who are saying he's a false apostle and he's a liar and all of this stuff. So Paul says, hey, I'll take some of y'all with me. And so here's this entourage. So for propriety, for protection, but also one of the largest problems in the first century church is this racial tension between Jew and Gentile. And so here is Paul with this group of Gentiles coming down with all of this money to help who? The Jewish Christians. Now, if Paul had gone alone, and he could have, and handed, here's this ex-Pharisee, a Jew of the Jews, Pharisee of the Pharisees, and he's handing these Jewish Christians all of this money. He says, it's from the Gentile churches. But what a stronger statement it is for Paul and 8 Gentiles, representatives of these churches, to walk into that Jerusalem assembly and say, we love you, and this is for you, to help you. And so when we first meet Tychicus, he's a courier along with Paul. He is a courier taking this money to these Jewish Christians, these beloved brethren in Jerusalem. And maybe for protection, maybe for propriety, but man, what a way to bridge that gap. So the first time we meet Tychicus, he's a courier. The second time we meet him, we hear him, not a courier, a missionary. The second time we meet him, he's a courier. The first time he's on a mission to Jerusalem along with Paul, but the second and third times he's mentioned, he's a courier, because we find him with Paul in AD 62. And at this time, Paul is in prison at Rome. It's his first imprisonment. He would soon be let go. And history tells us he went to Spain, and then he came back to Rome when he was imprisoned a second time and ultimately executed. But here we are in AD 62, and Paul sitting in prison in house arrest. He's writing letters. 3 specific. He writes a letter to the church at Ephesus. He writes a letter to the church at Colossae. And then he writes a personal letter to a man by the name of Philemon. And what's interesting, the next 2 times we read about Tychicus, it's in Ephesians 6, verses 21 and 22, and in Colossians 4, verses 7 and 8. And so let's turn over there real quick, and let's catch this as well. Ephesians 6 and verses 21 and 22, and we mentioned 21 to introduce, but putting it back into the context, Paul, writing to the Ephesians, says, so that you also may know how I am and what I am doing. Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will tell you everything. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. Similar statement is found in Colossians. In Colossians, the 4th chapter, in verse 7, Paul, as he's closing out this letter, he says, Tychicus will tell you all about my activities. He is a beloved brother and faithful minister and faithful servant in the Lord. I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your heart. That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? That's why Ephesians and Colossians are considered twin letters. But so Tychicus, you see, was from Asia. And that's where Ephesus and Colossae were located, in that Asia area. And so for Tychicus to go and to carry these letters, he was known to these Christians. He was known to them. They knew his reputation. They knew and loved him. And Paul, with Tychicus, sends a runaway slave back to his master, a man by the name of Onesimus. And with this runaway slave, Tychicus and Onesimus have this letter written to his master, Philemon. Now, this may seem weird to us, because when we send a letter, what do? We hit send on our text, right? Or we hit send on an email. Or maybe, if we want to get really old-fashioned and really show someone we care, we'll lick it. Well, we don't even have to lick stamps anymore. We peel off a sticker, put it on an envelope, and pull the flag up on the mailbox, and a total stranger picks it up, sends it to about 15 different cities so it can go to the house across the street and then be delivered. That's not how they did it in Roman times. They didn't have a Roman post office like we would have. No, it was customary in this first century time period for co-workers or personal friends to take a letter written by someone and deliver that letter. In fact, the custom was introduced by Augustus Caesar himself. And the purpose of the custom was that the individuals who was delivering the letter, they knew the writer, and so they could answer questions about them. They could answer anything that was vague or any questions of authenticity. And so that was the custom in the first century. And so this was an extremely important mission, because Tychicus wasn't carrying a happy birthday to you card or a get well card. What was he carrying? He was carrying 3 very important letters that now make up the canon of the New Testament, right? These were inspired writings from an apostle to other Christians. And can you imagine what would have happened if Paul had just given it to just anybody? The possibilities of the letter not getting there, or the possibilities. I mean, look at the good that these letters did, not only for the congregations in Ephesus and Colossae, but look at what good the letter did for Onesimus and the relationship he had with Philemon. And look at the good that these letters have done for the last 2,000 years, encouraging Christians and strengthening Christians and teaching Christians about the church and about Jesus' relationship to the church. Think of what we read and learn in Ephesians and Colossians, just those 2 letters. And so Tychicus had this extremely important assignment. He just wasn't delivering letters. It goes far beyond that when we really dig deep and start to think about it. And I wonder what Tychicus thought. I can't imagine that he actually understood how that these letters in his satchel that he is taking would actually outlast the Roman Empire itself and be studied all these millennia later. And so when we break down this mission of a courier, we think of courier, and that's kind of a minimum wage job that isn't really important, and anybody can hop on a bike in a big city and carry a letter from one building to the next. But just break down what Tychicus had to be responsible for. He's delivering this letter to the Ephesians, and he's going to Colossae with another. And these letters, according to scholars, based on Colossians 4 and verse 16, scholars think that these letters were circular. And so when the Ephesians read it, they would copy it and pass it on to another local congregation there, and then they would circle the area. And so these two letters weren't just meant for two congregations, but all of the congregations in Asia Minor, just beginning with Ephesus and beginning with Colossae. Think of the personal letter to Philemon and how important that was. Now, Philemon lived in Colossae, and so here's Tychicus. He's going along with Onesimus, who must have been so nervous. His life on the line, possibly, legally, could have been, because he's a runaway slave. But Paul is trying to bridge the gap. And so Tychicus walks with Onesimus up to Philemon's door, and he can attest that, yes, Onesimus obeyed the gospel. He's now a Christian, just like you are, Philemon. You two are brothers now. And here's Paul's letter, and here is some safety for Onesimus if Philemon had not acted as a Christian in that moment and put Onesimus' life in danger. Tychicus was there, and he could possibly have stepped up and talked some sense into the situation. But then Tychicus gets to go back home, where he's serving the Apostle Paul, and he gets to watch the Apostle Paul's face light up as he sees this great reunion. He tells him of this great reunion, of a relationship that was torn because one was a slave and one was a master, but now they're equal in Christ. But even more so to that, there's a third aspect of this, because Tychicus was to talk to the churches as he delivers the letters and tell them how Paul is and tell them how Paul is doing. Remember, he says he's going to make all things known to you, whom I have sent to you for this purpose, that you may know our affairs, so you can know what's going on with us and how we're doing. And he can fill them in on Paul's appeal to the emperor, and he could give and take back personal greetings and precious salutations. At Ephesus, Tychicus no doubt would have visited Trophimus. Trophimus is mentioned in Acts 20 and verse 4. He was also from Asia, but we learn in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 20 that Trophimus got sick. And it's possible that Trophimus recovered. We're not sure, but Tychicus could check on him and aid him in whatever he needs. And then, if he is well, bring the news back to Paul, who surely would have been waiting for it. You see, we see Tychicus as a courier here, but the term courier really doesn't fit what Paul had given him to do. The next time we read about him is in the book of Titus. In Titus chapter 3, in verse 12, here's what we read. He says, "When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at the Victory City, Nicopolis." Nike, that's Nike, it's Victory. Polis City. The Victory City, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Now we find Tychicus as a possible troubleshooter. He was a missionary, he was a courier. Now we see him as a troubleshooter. Paul could no longer travel freely, so we see him begin to send faithful men he trusted, men who proved to be faithful, out to these different areas in his place. And it seems like he seems to have sent Tychicus to to Crete in order to relieve Titus. And so he tells Titus that this is a possibility, that Tychicus may be coming. And you see, Titus had been left in Crete to set things in order. He was to put the organization right, in other words. But now Titus is going to be relieved by Tychicus, who would have taken up that mantle. Who would have taken up that mantle and been involved in this same kind of work. And so this involves troubleshooting. And this seems to have been during this interval somewhere between Paul's first and second Roman imprisonments. But finally, I think most importantly, overall, everything we've already mentioned, Tychicus was a fellow helper. He was a fellow helper. He served as a faithful minister. We read twice in Ephesians 6 and verse 21. And more than likely, this meant that he was a personal attendant to Paul himself. He helped Paul with things that Paul could not do because of that imprisonment. He helped Paul, and Paul always seemed in his letters to have at least one or two of these type of men with him to help him. And they would have had to have been devoted to the cause of Christ. And they would have had to have been individuals with a lot of loyalty and a lot of common sense and a good work ethic, and to pay good attention to detail. And they had to focus on that big picture, didn't they? And Tychicus evidently had that kind of work ethic and had that kind of attitude and had that kind of demeanor to where he didn't shrink back from a work that's so important. It's a very big possibility that Tychicus is the one Paul refers to in 2 Corinthians. This individual isn't named, so this is a little bit of conjecture. But if you look over at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and look at verses 22 and 23, Paul says, "And with them we are sending our brother, whom we have often tested and found earnest in many matters, but who is now more earnest than ever because of his great confidence in you. And as for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for your benefit. And as for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ." This version uses the word earnest. Other versions use the word diligent. Here's an individual that's diligent. And there are many who will argue that this unnamed brother was actually Tychicus. But Tychicus, like Titus, was a very diligent, earnest fellow helper of Paul. And even if this passage refers to someone else, it's probable that Tychicus had returned to Paul in Rome after leaving Crete, or maybe traveled with him if Artemis went to Crete, and was now being sent again to Ephesus. Now, he relieved Titus, but now he would relieve Timothy. Now he would relieve Timothy. Because in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 12, Paul writes, "Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus." And now, have sent, that's talking about something in the past, right? Have sent. In the Greek, and not to get into too much grammar, no eye rolling. There's something in the Greek that they would do in letters in particular. And they called it the epistolary aorist. Epistle is their word for letter. The aorist is one of the two past tense verbs they had. And they called it the epistolary aorist. How long would you think a letter would take to get across 2 or 3 countries in the first century? Today, if you send it by mail, if it gets there, it'll take about 10 days, 5 to 10 days. If you send it priority and pay the $102 to get it there. Back then, it would take weeks, months maybe. And so they would use this epistolary aorist, because by the time they read it, it would be in the past. But at the time they wrote it, it was either being done or about to be done. And so chances are Paul here is about to send. It has this meaning, I am sending or I am about to send Tychicus to Ephesus. But by the time the letter reaches Timothy, guess what? Tychicus would have already been sent. And so he writes it in the past tense, even though it hasn't quite happened yet, or it's in the middle of happening. And so here is Paul's last letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy, and by the time Timothy read it, Tychicus may have even already been there. But Paul sent Tychicus again and again, we read, again and again, on all of these important tasks, important work, and he had become such a dependable Christian and a mature Christian that he could take the place of leaders. Titus and Timothy were leaders of the church, and he could actually take their place and fulfill their responsibilities in their work. And from Tychicus, we learned something. That someone needs to always continue the good works that others have begun. Someone always needs to continue the good works that someone else has begun. In regard to Bible studies with new converts, there needs to be someone following up, right? In regards to congregations and leading, we have an eldership, but who's coming after? Someone always needs to pick up the mantle and continue the good work that others have begun. You know, some people are great at building things and starting things and beginning things. Some people are great at sustaining things and completing things and continuing things. Which group is more important? The truth is the church needs both, right? The church needs both. You can look at the world of baseball, and I try never to look at the world of baseball unless I want to take a nap. But you know what? You have your starting pitcher, and then you have your relief pitcher. And you better have both ready. You see, the church always needs someone to continue good works that others have begun. And so here we learn from Tychicus, and we see a man, an ordinary individual, and I dare say possibly before tonight you may not have even noticed his name. He is just an ordinary individual, and yet this shows us that ordinary people have an important place in the kingdom of God. Ordinary people can do great things, even if they're small, to advance the cause of Christ. You see, a few people, a few members can do a few things. And many members can do many things. But if we had the time, man, I wish we could just sit and plant for a while in 1 Corinthians 12. Paul talks about the body and the different parts of the body and how they all work together. Because while a few members can do a few things and many Christians can do many things, only all working together can do all things. And if we don't learn anything from Tychicus, if we don't take away anything else, we need to remember that even the ordinary people, outside of the Pauls and the Peters and the Davids and the Solomons, ordinary people, can do extraordinary things for the cause of Christ. It may be that there's some here this evening who needs to put on Christ in baptism, who needs to obey the gospel and be added to the family of God. And if that's your wish, we want to help you do that. Maybe there's someone here who needs for us to go to God in prayer on their behalf. We want to do that as well. Won't you come right now as we stand and sing?